So this happened a little over 2 years ago now. It was 2017, and I had just started a new job at a motel. It was low pay, but I needed an office job. One of my friends, John, got me this job. For a few days, I did training with the owner in the mornings. For 2 nights, John trained me. Our job was the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, nothing exciting, just checking guests in and doing paperwork. My boss, or the owner, went away with his wife on vacation for a week, which contributed to the swift training I had to endure. So it was my first night alone on the night shift. There was a monitor with security cameras around the motel's property and large glass windows all around the office building with a glass door. There was no night window like most motels have. It was fairly early in the night, at about 1 a.m. I was just doing my normal check-in paperwork when a man walked in and asked if we had any rooms available. Usually, if someone sketchy came in, my boss had me lie and say no. But he seemed normal at the moment, so without hesitation, I said yes. I began creating the reservation on the computer when I noticed he started swatting the air and making spitting noises as if he was being surrounded by flies. I tried to ignore it. As far as I was concerned, it wasn't my business, so I tried to check him into the room as quickly as possible. I gave him his key, and he was on his way. At this point in time, I could be described as very timid. I had a lot going on in my personal life, so I hope you can all understand my reaction to what happens next. The man came back from his room and slammed his hand on the glass door, causing me to jump, absolutely frightened. I looked up to see him just staring at me. He cracked the door and put his head through and said, "I can't get into my room. Why won't you let me into my room?" And my only defense is trying to be helpful, so I replied, "Maybe there's something wrong with your key. Let me give you another one." The look he had in his eyes was inexplicable. I felt like I was in absolute danger. I handed him his new key, and he went back to his room. I tried texting John because he's the one who trained me, though it was the middle of the night and he was asleep. I needed some guidance. With no reply from John, I noticed the man trudging down the stairs to come back. I went into absolute panic mode. I ran into the back office, locked the door, and pulled out my pocket knife. It's important to keep protection when working at night. I heard the man in the office yelling, "Hello? Hello? Why won't you let me into my room? Do you not like me?" Being an absolute idiot and not standing my ground or just calling the police when I was feeling scared, I decided to take the situation on alone. I replied, "I'm just on the phone. I'll be right out." I then started calling John over and over for help. No answer. I decided to take a few breaths and then step out of the office. The man was not there. He was in the bathroom. I started hearing him talking to himself angrily, saying, "Kill her, kill her." My heart sank. Still being an idiot and not calling the police, he came out, and I said, "Your key was broken. I'm sorry. Let me escort you to your room." He agreed. Thankfully, I was wearing a long-sleeved sweater, so with my arms down, I was able to hide my knife in my hand while holding it. I began to walk outside, and he seemed insistent on walking behind me. We began making our way to the staircase and up towards his room. I was sweating from how nervous I was, continuously looking behind me to make sure he wasn't going to make a move. He stopped at a room, and I stopped at his room a few doors down. I smiled and said, "Oh, that's the wrong room. This is your room," as it was clearly said on the door. This whole time, he was going to someone else's room and trying to open the door. After letting him into his room, I quickly ran back to the office and locked the door. I found out there was a lone woman staying in the other room he was trying to get into. The next guest I checked in was a police officer from a few towns over. I felt bad for confiding in him about the guy, but he seemed willing to keep an eye and ear out. The next night, the man came back, but I had the doors locked and told him we were all booked up. I explained to my boss what happened when he got back from vacation. However, he didn't take it very seriously. I continued to work there on the night shift for the next year, where many other strange encounters happened, but this was one of the worst. I was working as a waiter at Waffle House, choosing to work the third shift because I had the best hourly pay and brought in pretty good tips due to us being the only 24/7 diner in the entire town. It took me about a year to save up enough money to rent a place in the city and get out of the middle of nowhere, but in that time, I saw quite a few things that still stick with me to this day. By and large, most of the customers I had were truckers and other random people traveling on the interstate through the middle of the night. The town was just a stopover point, not a destination. The so-called locals consisted of farmers and ranchers from the surrounding area, and anyone else like me worked in the fast food and hotel chains clustered around the interstate exit. The final and yet most characteristic residents of that depressing cesspit of a town were the vagrants, hitchhikers, tweakers, and destitute opportunists that had been stranded with us. They could be stuck there from anywhere to a few days to several years, clinging to the parking lots and awnings that were the only meager shelter for dozens of miles in any direction, panhandling for whatever they could until they got lucky enough to get a ride to somewhere else. Really, the only stressful part of my job was dealing with these people. In the beginning, I tried to be empathetic. After all, they are human. However, it didn't take long to end up like my usual coworker, the cook who had been there for 10 years and had seen just about everything. His name was Tony, and the only thing separating him from them was a steady position at the grill. Nobody ever got a chair thrown at them, as far as I know, but Tony was prone to throwing turners and other utensils at anyone who got on his bad side. I usually followed his lead based on his body language. He knew who was trouble and who wasn't. However, even with Tony as a reliable backup, things sometimes got out of hand. There was this one night that I'll never forget. I don't remember what day of the week it was, but all I know was that it had been unusually slow that night. It was around 3 a.m. when this guy walked in, and even I knew something was not right about him. He was wearing soiled clothes and a completely torn-up jacket, covered head to toe in dust, and he was in a completely panicked state of mind. The weird thing was that he said nothing as he ran past us, clutching his right arm to his chest, and immediately locking himself in the bathroom. Tony and I rolled our eyes at the same time, thinking, "Here we go again." Although I think we both had a feeling this wasn't a regular hobo bathroom emergency or a tweaker looking for a private place to do their thing. That's when I asked Tony, "Doesn't he kind of look familiar?" He brushed it off at first, but then after a short conversation, we realized that he had been inside about 2 hours ago, desperately asking all the customers for rides until eventually, we had to kick him out for being a disturbance. It seemed he obviously hadn't had any luck getting a ride, but something else had happened to him too. I became worried. If that guy needed help, it would be a while before an ambulance could get to him and even longer for them to take him to a hospital. Tony told me to take care of it, so I ran to check on the only customer we had in the store at the time and got them on their way. When I took the bathroom keys and went to check on our stranger in distress, I knocked on the door pretty loud. I asked if everything was okay. There was a pause, then finally a distraught voice answered me, "I think I'm really hurt. I just need a ride." Suddenly, I knew something was seriously wrong. The sound of his voice made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I fumbled with the key ring as I told him I was about to open the door. "Sir, if you need help, I have to come in there," I shouted. "No," the stranger screamed. "You have to come get me." I stopped for a second, confused, but then I snapped out of it and shoved the key in the lock. I turned it and opened the door to a terrifying sight. The bathroom was empty, completely empty. No injured man, no blood, no dust, just nothing. It was as clean as it had been since I last cleaned it, as if nobody had been in there at all. In fact, it even looked cleaner than that. "What's going on in there?" Tony shouted from the kitchen. I was just at a loss. I let the bathroom door close and stepped back. I looked at Tony and told him the truth. "There's nobody in there," I said. "Don't give me that," Tony shouted. "See for yourself." I told him, and he did. He stormed over and barged through the bathroom door. I saw him go blank, just like I did when he saw it, the impossible absence of a person. He turned around and looked inside the women's room too, but again, nothing. Nobody in there. In raw disbelief, we gathered ourselves behind the counter. We interrogated each other uselessly, thinking one of us must have let him slip by unnoticed. However, we both knew we had been on high alert since the second he came in. There was no way either of us would have missed him leaving within a fraction of a second. Our conversation ended abruptly when we both saw the same thing out of the corner of our eyes. The stranger was somehow outside, looking at us through the window. He still had his right arm stuffed out of sight, but now, as we got a better view of his face, we saw that wasn't his only problem. His face was bloody, like he'd been hit with a brick. His nose was broken, his lip was split and missing a piece, showing us his cracked and missing teeth. One of his eyes seemed completely swollen over, but the one that was open was gushing blood. Tony and I didn't move a muscle. We didn't even breathe for a second. After a few horrible seconds of realizing what was happening, I finally thought to call 911. But as soon as the idea occurred to me, the man started to move. He turned to the side and started to limp across the big front window. We watched him in silence as he made it all the way to the corner of the window, where it wrapped around to the other side. "What the hell?" I whispered, only for Tony to quickly shush me. It was at that moment I saw he had gone pale and wide-eyed, which only terrified me even more. Something about this man had gotten through Tony's defenses, and that meant we were not prepared. Before we could say anything else, we heard a crash from the back room. We both ran inside and searched for the source of the noise. It was coming from the walk-in freezer. Somebody was tearing things up and freaking out. Tony ran up there and threw open the door, and there he was, the guy. He had ripped open a box of burger patties and was clutching a handful of meat, pressing it to his right arm like an ice pack. When he saw us, he froze. The patties dropped from his hand and revealed the condition of his arm. His hand was stuck in a thumbs-up position, but his wrist had been snapped clean off, and his hand was dangling from the rest of his arm by a thread of skin. After a terrifying moment of deer-in-headlight stares, the stranger bolted from the freezer, crashing through both me and Tony. He sprinted outside, screaming, before we had a chance to react. I stumbled to my feet as Tony ran out to the dining area, locked the front doors, and switched off all the lights. Then he pushed me back into the back room and started yelling at me. "How could you leave the back door unlocked?" he yelled. "No, look. It's still locked." I pointed to the back door, and sure enough, it was locked now. Absolutely nothing was making sense, but we gave up on trying to decipher it for the rest of the night until the sun came up and the morning crew came in. We kept the doors locked and stayed out of sight. When we were finally freed from our nightmare of a shift and set out into the world, we noticed the train of police and paramedics on the freeway right outside of town. We asked around only to find out that a man had been killed in a hit-and-run right there at the off-ramp not even 1,000 feet from the Waffle House. He died sometime after midnight, but his body lay on the shoulder undiscovered until daylight. His corpse was mangled, but his thumb was still sticking straight up from trying to hitch a ride. Of course, by the afternoon, they had scraped him off the pavement and washed away his blood until the spot where he died was cleaner than I'd ever seen it. My name is Maury. I'm from the USA. Years ago, I worked in a home for older people as a nurse. I had the night shift. We were together drinking coffee on the second floor. All of a sudden, we heard a loud bang, so we thought a client had fallen. We decided that I would take the second floor and my colleague would take the first. Maybe we could find out what happened. While my colleague walked down the stairs, I looked at the monitor, which was on the second floor, and I saw someone in the department on the ground floor. He was inside the closed apartment. You could walk in over there, but you needed a code to get out. People with dementia lived there. We watched for a while, and the guy was stuck, he couldn't get out. We decided to go inside a room on the second floor of one of our clients because you needed a special key to go inside. We thought that was safer. We explained to her what was going on. She was perfectly capable of understanding the situation, and of course, we called 112. I explained the situation, and they told me they would come right away. I called my husband, who also had the night shift as a security guard in another town not too far away from us. He was just talking with the cops while I called 112 and said they were on their way. When I hung up, I looked outside and saw that guy climbing out the window. So I called back. They asked if something had changed. The police arrived, and we did a walk with them throughout the whole building. The guy broke the door in the kitchen. His stuff to break the door was there on the ground. The police couldn't really do much. I don't even know if they found the guy. Later that day, we heard that they were riding around the building 2 hours before the guy went in, and the guy had walked all over the ground floor, all while we were having our coffee on the second floor. That's a pretty scary thought. The next day, I had one more night shift. Though I don't have that much to fear, it was still pretty scary. So I asked if I could bring my 2 dogs. We had 2 golden at the time, and they were actually okay with that. So I brought them with me the next night. Nothing happened. The dogs walked with me the whole night, and of course, I let them outside now and then to do their thing. The other night, 2 other colleagues had the night shift, and guess what? They came back. They had robbed the safe. I always thought that the guy we had was just looking around to see if he could get away, but they had planned to come back for the safe the next night. But I'm guessing the 2 golden scared them off. I wouldn't go inside if there were 2 dogs like that either if I didn't know them. Later on, I always brought my dogs if I ever did the night shift over there. Most colleagues would be happy if they worked with me because they felt safe with the dogs, and so did I. The funny thing was that the dogs knew the route we always walked. After a few times, I didn't even put their leash on, they just knew. If we needed to help a client, they just waited in the hallway until I was done. A few clients knew it because I told them, knowing that they loved dogs. So when they needed our help, the dogs went with us in their apartment. Both the dogs and clients loved that. I regrettably used to work at a hotel in our town. Our town had gotten hit by a hurricane a few months back, and a lot of houses were badly damaged, so many people vacated the place. The hotel is about a 15-minute walk from my house. The town and hotel name I'll leave out of this, as I really just don't want anything traced back to me. The hotel was a very standard bed and breakfast type place, you know, where they serve wet scrambled eggs, frozen sausages, and assorted cereals. The hotel had a busy month after the hurricane, as some people were out of their houses due to damages. But after a while, things quieted down, if anything, quieter than before the hurricane. I always worked nights from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. Then someone would relieve me at 2 a.m., and they'd work till 10 o'clock or 11 a.m. I could always see how many people were checked into the hotel, and at the time, it was only maybe 9 rooms, which wasn't a lot at all. I could go the whole night sometimes without seeing anyone. There was a back break room for employees with a coffee machine, fridge, table, and a couple of sofa-type chairs. The employee bathroom was also back there. At night, I spent most of my time back there. There was a bell at the front desk that people would ring if they needed anything. I was in the back when I heard a deep voice from the lobby saying, "Hello," repeatedly. I got up and went through the door leading to behind the counter and saw a man on the other side of the glass. There was a glass barrier with an opening underneath about 10 inches high. He said he needed towels. I grabbed him a couple of extra towels and slid them under the glass for him. He grabbed them rather aggressively, shot me this weird look, then walked to the room's hallway. I stayed in the lobby, now sitting in the rolling chair by the monitors, and I just watched that man on the camera walk down the hallway. He was looking around weirdly, then he started rubbing the towels on his face. I said out loud, "What in the world?" Then he got in the elevator, so I went back to the break room. It was maybe 10 minutes later when I heard a voice again from the lobby. It was the same voice. I walked back out, and that man was standing on the other side again. He said very loudly, "My key card is broken." I asked what his room number was. He said it was something random, like 2C something with a letter in it. Our hotel rooms strictly had numbers, no letters, so I knew this man was lying. I told him, "Sir, our rooms don't have letters. Are you sure you're staying here?" His reaction was not something I was expecting, nor was it something I wish I ever had to be a victim to. He threw the towels on the floor, started smiling, and slightly tilting his head as he got closer to the glass. When his face was practically pressed up on the glass, he said, "I'm going to kill you," still with a smile on his face. Then he said it again, louder, and again. Each time he said it, it got louder until it was almost a scream. I screamed back at him, "I'm calling the police," and I did. I picked up the phone and showed him as I dialed 911. He kept his disturbing smile as he now started mocking me, calling the police. As I spoke to the dispatcher on the phone, explaining very loudly what was happening in front of my face, the sick man laughed and headed for the door in a slow walk. I told the dispatcher he was leaving, and when he was gone through the doors and out of sight, I said he was gone. She asked me if I still wanted an officer to show up, and I said no, it's all right. So the next couple of hours of my shift went slow. I decided for obvious reasons to hang around in the lobby now instead of the break room. There was one guest who checked in during this time. At around 2 a.m., my relief came, and I clocked out and was free to go home. I walked outside to the parking lot. It was cold out. I remember wishing I had brought my coat. I walked with my hands in the pockets of my light jacket and my hood up. Then I heard a voice in the parking lot. I turned around. There was a line of bushes that covered the first-floor windows of the hotel. It came from the bushes. I don't know what the voice said. I didn't care. I walked faster now. Once I got out of the parking lot, I was on a main road for a brief minute, but there were no cars on the road in this quiet town at this hour. After a minute, I turned left down a residential street that would eventually turn onto my block. It was dead silent out, not even the sound of any distant traffic, just the sound of my shoes hitting the pavement. And then the sound of someone else's shoes hitting the pavement behind me, only it was the sound of someone running as if on their tiptoes, trying to be quiet. By the time I turned around, they stopped. There was a car right behind me, and I almost knew that there was someone hiding behind it. I heard laughing and then a familiar voice saying quietly, "I'm going to kill you." Without even seeing him, I knew it was that man. I looked around, planning out my next move. I couldn't outrun a man, let alone wearing my work shoes. I looked at the nearest house. It had an upstairs light on. Someone was awake. I would go run and ring the doorbell for help. I looked back at the car, and I saw him, that man, peeking his eyes out from behind the car as he inched around it to the front. When he got to the hood, the rest of his face and upper body were exposed, and I could see his disgusting, crazy smile again. I ran for the house, screaming, "Help me!" I made it to the front door and rang the bell at least 3 times. That's when the man grabbed me and started choking me, whispering in my ear, "Die." In that moment, I thought my life was flashing before my eyes. Then an angel in the form of a man opened the front door to the house and screamed, "Hey," at the man choking me. The man's grip was released from my neck, and I fell to the floor. I never turned to watch the man run away, but the man from the house helped me up and brought me inside. He gave me water and called the police for me, and I explained the whole story to the police. They collected the CCTV footage of the man from the hotel and put feelers out to track him. I was called into the police station when they did a lineup of people who looked similar to the man on the CCTV footage, and I was asked to point out which man I thought was him. I looked at all 5 of them for like 5 minutes, and I ultimately said it wasn't any of them. I don't know if the pressure and nerves got to me, but in the moment, I truly didn't recognize him to be in that lineup. I hope to this day I didn't make a mistake and let that man roam free. I used to work as a night clerk in a downtown condominium. The association had a lot of security concerns due to the way the building was constructed back in the late 60s. Both levels of the parking garage were accessible from street level, so there were a lot of possible entry points, many of which were located in blind spots of the security camera system. For that reason, I was required to make 2 rounds around the entire building during my shift to make sure no non-residents had found their way in. The most serious issue we had was the occasional carjacking, but what I encountered most often was homeless people who had found their way into the garage and were huddling in some corner for a bit of shelter. Kicking them back out into the street was by far my least favorite part of the job, but I had to do it. After working there for several months, I knew all the spots that people liked to hide in. The building was very old and had undergone many renovations in its lifetime, which created a lot of nooks and crannies, unnecessary concrete protrusions, sealed-off rooms, and hallways and stairs that led to nowhere. The creepiest spot in the whole building was so weird and potentially dangerous that I took a picture of it and brought it up to management. On the first floor of the garage, there was a door that opened up to a corridor directly underneath the ramp up to the second level of the garage. It was about 3 feet wide and ran about 20 to 30 feet, but it led to literally nowhere. At the end of it was a large water pipe with a valve, which was the only reason the space existed. But in the dark, with just a weak flashlight, that pipe seemed to take on many other forms. What made it dangerous, however, was the lock on the door. There was no padlock or keyhole on either side, but on the outside was a large sliding bolt latch. There was only one way in or out, and it locked from the outside with no way to unlock it from the inside. Ever since I discovered the spot, I couldn't help but imagine how easy it would be for someone to get trapped in there. However, nothing I said to management made any difference. They were already aware of it and had no intention of doing anything about it. Unfortunately, that meant I would have to open the door and check on it every night, but I never stepped foot inside of it. I was way too scared of it. Things went on like that for months, and then one day my worst fear was realized. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, halfway through my shift. I was doing my rounds in the parking garage, and everything was normal. It was a slow Wednesday night. There hadn't been any problems or suspicious activity on the cameras, so I was far from on edge at the time. But then, in one moment, I was forced to go on alert. I heard the sound of a door slamming across the garage. I wasn't exactly sure where it was, so I walked over to investigate. My heart sank a bit when I saw that the door to the dead-end hallway was wide open. I looked around to see if anyone was in the garage, but I appeared to be alone. I shouted to intimidate anyone if they were hiding somewhere I couldn't see, but I got no response and nobody appeared. I was just worried that there was somebody hiding in the dead-end hallway, so I walked the rest of the way. I shined my flashlight down the hallway, and for a moment, I was relieved to see that nobody was in there. There was, however, an empty glass bottle about 10 feet inside. I sighed and rolled my eyes, thinking that somebody had been drinking in there and had run out in a hurry once they saw me snooping around, accidentally making noise as they rushed. It wouldn't have been that hard for somebody to climb up on the cars parked there to get above the wall and hop the fence into the neighboring parking lot. By the time I got there, since the garage was partially underground in that spot, in fact, that's how a lot of people get in because the dead-end hallway happened to be in a prominent blind spot of the cameras. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to leave trash anywhere if I saw it, so I knew I had to pick up that bottle. Of course, I felt the anxiety bubbling up inside my gut just for knowing I had to walk a few steps inside that hallway. I almost didn't do it, but I rationalized myself into thinking there was no way somebody would pop out and lock me in. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, but right as I reached the bottle, the door slammed shut. I immediately ran back to the door, but by the time I got there, it was already locked. I started banging on the door and screaming for help, but there was nobody there. I felt like I was being buried alive, like I could barely breathe. If it weren't for my flashlight, I would have been in some deep trouble. I wouldn't have been able to see a thing. Once I realized I wasn't getting out anytime soon, I reached for my phone. To my utter heartbreak, however, there was no service at all. The walls were made of cinder blocks, the door was made of metal, and the entire 6-story building was on top of me. No matter what I tried, I couldn't call 911. There was absolutely nothing I could do. I was completely stuck. The only way I was getting out was if somebody opened the door from the outside. But it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and it would be hours before anybody left for work. During that time, whoever trapped me was doing whatever they pleased in the parking garage. I heard several car alarms go off, and I knew what was happening. Somehow, they all turned off after a few minutes. I kept banging on the door and shouting, but nobody came. After a while, if I'm being completely honest, I gave up hope that I would be free anytime soon and just focused on staying calm. I sat down against the wall and turned off my flashlight to save the battery, but only after making sure I was completely alone. Every few minutes, I banged on the door a bunch of times. It took me about 2 hours, but finally, I managed to get the attention of somebody going to work early in the morning. I thanked them as they let me out, but unfortunately, the next thing I had to do was call the cops because I quickly noticed that a dozen cars had been broken into. There was broken glass all over the parking lot from all the windows that had been shattered. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to trap me in there and how to silence the alarms of the cars they were breaking into. We only had security guards on the weekends, and it left us vulnerable on a seemingly benign Wednesday. All in all, there were tens of thousands of dollars in damages and theft, and I was fired from my job. Not that I would want to go back anyway. The culprit was never identified on the cameras and was never caught.